Okay, since we're all talking about markets, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to take a look. And this is not scientific. This is not to be taken with anything other than a standard grain of salt. Because we talk about what markets work and what markets don't. And the reality is, some markets work that we don't think do, and there are markets that aren't making as much money as we may think that they do as well. So what I did was I went to ESPN and found the average attendance per game for every team. Then I went through a site called Vivid Seats to find what they said was the average season or average ticket value per game, per seat, whatever, for each team in the NHL. And I did multiplication of, I times the attendance by the median value. So that's it. I don't know the exact values. And then I multiplied that by 41 because you have 41 home games. And some interesting things came out of that. According to that, the Chicago Blackhawks with 21,653 fans per game and a $229 average ticket price were number 2 in ticket revenue with $203 million. Number 1 won't surprise anybody. The Toronto Maple Leafs drew 19,187 per game, but the average ticket price was $275, $216 million. Toronto's number 1. So by that math. And interestingly enough, right next to them is Tampa with 19,092, but their average ticket price $125. So they drew 97 million, which was good for 13th in the league. So this is where it's interesting to me. So Tampa, we can all say good team, played really well this year, better than Toronto, and yet their ticket prices are less than half of Toronto's, but they're still 13th in revenues. Contrast that with Calgary, with 18,905 fans per game, $99 average ticket price. That would leave them drawing $76 million, which is 19th. Which actually adds up to what Bettman and all the ownership's been saying, that this arena doesn't help them make money. And the reason they look at Edmonton is simple. Edmonton drew less fans, so 18,347, but charged them almost double. $180 on average. They generated $135 million. That's a $60 million difference going into the owners' pockets, or at the very least the NHL's pockets, and redistributed. And they're number 7 in revenue generating, just based on tickets, just based on this graph. The Washington Capitals, 18,774, $92 average, $70 million. Ones that interested me were like, here's Detroit. Now, if you watched any Detroit games this year, they looked empty, but their paid attendance was 19,515, which means the NHL doesn't care those seats are empty because they're paid to be empty. $170 average equals $136 million. They're still number 6 in revenue generating in the NHL, even though the team stunk. And yeah, those fans didn't show up, but they paid for those seats. Minnesota, of course, we can all agree Minnesota is a hockey mecca. 19,036 average, $155 per ticket average. $121 million, generated less revenue than Detroit. And yet you watch a game in Minnesota and it's full. You watch a game in Detroit and it's not. Winnipeg, the little engine that could. 15,321 average because they have a small venue. But average ticket price of $176 equals $110 million, or 9th in the NHL. So really, if you're in Winnipeg, you're paying a mint for tickets. You're getting your value right now, and you're making sure there's no chance the NHL is going to go anywhere. Vancouver, which is close to where I am, 18,078 average. Again, much like Detroit, a lot of them stayed home during a lot of games this year. $107 average ticket price, $79 million in revenue generated from tickets, 18th in the NHL. And I'm not getting into the generating of revenue through selling merchandise through their stores and all this, because that changes everything. But what's interesting is just from tickets, Vegas, 18,042 fans on average, $136 average per ticket, $100 million. They're at number 12 in revenue generated through tickets, according to this chart. Which shows the NHL made the right decision to go to Vegas. They're number 12 in tickets right now. Or number 12 in revenue. They're nowhere near that in attendance. I think they're 17th in attendance. Boston's interesting because their original 6, 17,565, $145 average, $104 million generated, 11th in the NHL. San Jose surprises me in that their 17,365 fans per game is lower than a lot of teams. $91 average is low. $64 million generated. They're 23rd in revenue generated in the NHL from tickets. Again, according to this chart. I keep wanting to say it because it's like people are just going to look at this like, is this the gospel? No, this is just a chart that I made up. And it adds up because, look, 31st is the Islanders, 30th is Arizona, 29th is Florida, 28th is Carolina. So it seems like the math works out pretty darn well. But the interesting thing is Arizona's not last. That 12,002 fans per game for the Islanders, that's insanely low. $73 average ticket price, $36 million generated for this season. 31st. Look at this. $216 million in Toronto, $36 million for the Islanders. This is why we have a salary cap. If we did not have a salary cap, this would be the difference between the salaries that teams could afford to pay. As wide as that gap was 12 years ago when the salary cap was brought in, or 13 years ago when the salary cap was brought in, it would be much, much worse now. Because the prices paid for those prime tickets in Chicago, Montreal, Toronto, Detroit, they're really expensive. Your tickets in Arizona, Carolina, Florida, and on the island, by comparison, are much, much lower. I'm not saying that these tickets are cheap. For a guy who's trying to feed his family and works your regular everyday job, these tickets are not cheap. Another interesting one, because people complain about Nashville, and, well, Nashville's not really a hockey market. You don't hear that as much now that they're successful, but a few years ago, yeah. 17,307, but they charge $198 per ticket. $140 million revenue generated, and 5th in the NHL. Interestingly, the Penguins, who won back-to-back cups, 18,579 fans per game, way above Nashville, but they only charge $124 average per ticket, meaning $94 million in ticket revenue, or 14th on this chart. Nashville 5th. So what I did was, I've got this organized by the highest attendance and the lowest attendance. But what's funny is some of the teams that are at the top, like Philly, 19,517 fans per game. That's excellent. $131 average ticket price, $104 million revenues, $104 million in revenues generated, which leaves them 10th, even though their attendance is at 3rd. That's what I was hoping to see. Like I put this up on the board this morning, thinking let's take a look and see where the real hockey markets are. And people who are in Canada are right. You know, Canadian teams generally revenue generate. Oh, nope. Ottawa, 15,829 on average, $101 per ticket average, $65 million generated, 22nd. And that's where it gets tricky, because in order to compete with the American dollar, which is currently roughly 20% above the Canadian dollar, you have to charge your attendees 20% more than the American teams do. Then you got to factor in that teams like Tampa, I believe in Arizona too, I'm not sure on that, but in a lot of these locations in the States, Florida definitely, you get tax breaks. So as a player, if you're playing in one of these Canadian cities, you may want more money because you're going to pay more taxes, whereas in one of these southern locations, you may not pay a lot of taxes. So it makes more sense to sign for the exact same amount of money in a southern location as you would in a northern. So a Canadian team is forced to pay more to keep its talent. And then they're forced to charge more for tickets than the American counterparts would. Now, Toronto, it's just downright, it's price gouging. It's because the demand is so high in Toronto, they're absolutely soaking the fans. And Toronto fans will line up for it to happen to them. They've been doing it for years. This team wasn't in the playoffs for, a decade? and still sellouts every night. So definitely, because that market is so huge and is so rabid for hockey, they don't care that the hockey sucked for those 10 years. They just line up and they drive up that price. This is why anytime I see something like, oh, Leafs announced they're not raising ticket prices next year, I go, oh, bully for them. I know the Canucks announced that for, I think next year they announced they're not raising ticket prices. Well, good, because the team's been kind of bad. So I would think that raising ticket prices right after your team's been awful is probably a bad idea. And yet Buffalo still draws 18,563 fans per game. But their median ticket price is $83, so they still generate the 24th highest revenue on this chart at $63 million. It's an interesting thing to look at. I just thought it would be a fun thing for us to look at. And I know this isn't 100%. I understand. And I know people are going to come in and go, this isn't correct. And what about prices? What about these revenues? What about... I know. I'm talking ticket prices because what I had heard, okay, from general managers and just NHL people had always said that about 50% of their revenues came from tickets. And that, tickets were really what drove the NHL. That it was nice to have the sales of the merchandise and everything, but in terms of actual profit, it's the tickets. Now, some of these cities also have rights to the building and parking, so they'll generate parking revenue as well, and they have rights to all the concessions in the building. Some of them may not. That concessions money may go to somebody else outside the building who contracts in, but I'm just looking at tickets. So, because I think it's interesting. Because some of the have-nots, like a small market Winnipeg, generate a ton of revenue, and some of the put-upon teams that Canadians seem to go, oh, we're better than them. Nashville 5th, Vegas 12th in their first season. So and the reason I bring this up is simple. We could all look at Vegas right now and say, oh, well, whatever, if they were only charging $50 a ticket. If their ticket prices were so much cheaper than everybody else's, we go, just wait till they have to pay a real ticket price. They're paying a real ticket price. They're paying more in Vegas than Vancouver's paying, and they're generating almost as many fans per game, even though Vancouver has a higher capacity than Vegas. I believe. Let me double check. I'm pretty sure about that, though. Because Vancouver was generating 90. Vancouver's got an attendance capacity for this year was 95.6%. Vegas was at 103.9%. So there you go. Vegas is pulling in a ton of fans, and they're generating a ton of money. And if you want to get into actual merchandise, I guarantee Vegas is really high, because Vegas being brand new, everybody has to buy their jersey, their hats, their scarves, their everything. Little foam fingers. Everything adds up to revenue, and Vegas generates a ton of it. So there you go, kind of a fun thing. Let me know what you guys think on the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. Just happened upon this video. And I figured all this out on my phone using the calculator, because I'm a nerd like that. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.